biology by effectively measuring a whole series. This is where the data integration comes in. All right? So a whole series of data being applied to the same problem. So you've got these drug molecules, and the difference here is, okay, drug molecule comes in, binds to a receptor, target binding takes place, and then, it affects that protein function. So that, it inhibits that enzyme. This is standard stuff. But what is the implications of that? All right? The implications are, within the complete biological network, that uptake of metabolites and other things are impacted here because this is no longer working in the same way. That has a whole set of downstream effects. So it has a systematic response throughout this network, which ultimately leads to something else that you can measure. In this case, say secretion. So what we can do is we can measure uptakes, we can measure secretion, we can measure a whole series of parameters around this, and that allows us to say a lot more about this whole network than we could say, or a lot more than we could say before, by using the whole network. So what we've done, in effect, without giving you any of the details, but this is what systems biology is starting to bring to the table. So, this has been the traditional thing. We've gone straight from the molecule to the physiological process in the human. What we're starting to understand what's going on, that's the traditional approach. The new approach is essentially to start looking at what perturbation occurs when, first of all, that you have multiple targets. And when you have multiple targets, what are those multiple targets? What impact does it have on the whole network? And then you start looking at that. This is just one metabolic pathway, for example. Then you look at that in the context of the whole network. And then you start looking at the impact on physiological processes. And the way you do this is you bring in lots of different types of data that you never that were not used in this traditional approach. So you're using gene expression data, for example. You're actually mining the literature looking for evidence that these particular pathways are perturbed by chemicals like this or similar chemicals, and a whole host of other information as well. So that's really the systems-based approach. And I think what we're starting to see is a changeover from this traditional approach of trying to find one dedicated receptor and one very specific drug molecule to accepting this more generalized notion and using it. And what that's doing is actually driving more of the drug discovery process back into entities that are familiar with doing this kind of work, which was not traditionally done in drug companies. Novartis is now an example of a company that's sort of leading this, but it's still not going on very much. A lot of it now is being outsourced. So right now, from our point of view, and this is like for the Rady students particularly, is we're starting to see quite a shift in the way that things are being funded. So we're seeing NIH money for this kind of research, any kind of research, is dropping off. But sponsored research is actually increasing. And right now, for example, I have contracts with 3 drug companies to do this kind of work. Because you can imagine, just giving them some information that they can then go and test that they didn't have before. So imagine you've got in an early stage, you want to fail early and you want to fail cheaply with a molecule if it's not going to work. You don't want to be in the torcetrapib situation where they spent 15 years and $850 million only to see it drop out of phase 3 clinical trial. You would want to know that it's not going to work right at the beginning. And these kinds of techniques supplement what was being done before, because when you were testing a molecule experimentally against panels, those panels are pretty narrow. Now you can sort of, in silico, look at a large part of the human proteome as possible binding partners. So there are lots of limitations with this, which I'll get to. But so I just described, essentially this idea of finding off targets early and deciding what to do. And then down here in the whole cell and molecular pharmacology part of the drug discovery process, we now got this systems approach. So just to end with a few words of caution, I'm very zealous and enthusiastic about this, but drug companies are not so enthusiastic about computational approaches. They use them, computational chemistry and so on. But I think there's a certain level of mistrust within these companies about how well these things work, and I think that's probably justified, because in some ways a lot of things have been oversold. When the human genome was done, drug companies, at one point, I guess in the early 2000s maybe, half of all the bioinformatics scientists in the world were working in drug companies because they just scooped up everyone they could get. And now hardly any of them are, because they didn't actually produce anything that useful. So, and now there's being a bit of a resurgence. But it's like artificial intelligence. It was oversold, and at the same time now it's got a new name, and it's actually having knowledge discovery and these kinds of things. It's having a huge impact now in different ways. So it was just oversold early. Likewise, I think omics was oversold. The human genome didn't bring forth immediately the effects it should, but it's clear that it will start to do so. If you've got $50 genomes and you asked about personalized medicine, well, what we've done so far is we've looked at targets that we know about. We know these targets. Okay, these are the targets of drugs. And if there is some genetic modification within a segment of the population, that might tell you something about the effectiveness of that drug. But that's just a tiny piece of the puzzle. What about all these off-targets? They also have genetic propensity within the population. And then there's all the stuff that's actually non-coding that's also incredibly important, and we're just starting to begin to grapple with. But we will make progress, and the more sequences we have, the more it's going to happen. And then, as I said, openness wasn't alien culture, but we're starting to see a shift. So yes, a drug company is not going to give away its compound library and put it into the public domain. That's its intellectual property. But they are willing to share with parts of it with certain organizations, universities, under certain circumstances. And they're also, from the point of view of sharing platforms and IT and infrastructure to support the drug discovery process, they're actually starting to do that. So I'll just end by saying that I had a great talk at this couple of years ago at this Sage Bionetworks meeting, where they had one of the, I think he was the fourth employee at Facebook. Needless to say, he was quite well off. Okay, that was before, even now, given their share prices and everything else. But before that, he'd worked at Bear Stearns. And Bear Stearns had essentially done everything in a closed environment. They actually built their own computer chips. They built their own operating systems to run those chips. They built their own financial models, and they tried to outdo everybody else with those models. Well, guess what? Goldman Sachs and all the others were doing exactly the same thing at the same time, spent billions building the same kinds of infrastructure, and in the end really got nowhere. I mean, in the end, many of them collapsed, maybe for different reasons. But it was not necessarily the best use of resources. They could have pooled at some level. They could have had their own proprietary models, but some of the underlying infrastructure could be the same. And the same thing has happened in drug companies. They've built huge platforms independently to support their discovery pipelines. And now they're beginning to see the value in sharing elements of those pipelines. So, he was saying that, because he was now consulting for the drug discovery industry. And then he said Facebook is essentially a completely open system. And in principle, it was making money hand over foot. But anyway, you sort of get the idea. So, I think this kind of openness we're going to see more and more of this. And it's kind of the new knowledge economy, that you effectively provide all of this, the content base is free, and then new business models emerge on top of that free content base. And that's true of open access literature. Who uses Mendeley here? No one. Okay, well, it proves me wrong already. But there are lots of tools starting to emerge on top of using free open content that companies are making money from, and everybody benefits from. So that's kind of the end. And I can see by the look on your faces you're not so inclined to read any more about this. But should you be, there is a nice review that was done, and I can now take any questions.